Sì, per fare un buon giallo ci sono molte cose complesse, perché è un genere così tipicamente italiano.
It starts out looking like a relatively conventional mystery and then just goes off the rails and becomes something that's quite difficult to predict until you've seen a lot of them.
Perché il giallo deve essere un film di suspense, un film di sorpresa.
Lots of nubile young women, outrageous set pieces.
Heightened on every single respect, from sexuality to morality to violence.
È un genere che richiede soprattutto la capacità di tenere lo spettatore sempre fermo sulla sedia, perché se c'hai un momento di caduta cade tutto, capito?
The Giallo is basically an Agatha Christie style thriller in which you have a bunch of suspects, at least one dead person, sometimes a series of dead people, and an investigation of some kind, generally not an official investigation, and if there is an official investigation, it's probably not going very well. So there's some lone individual who will come in and be the person who directs that investigation in however bizarre a way to a place where a solution is arrived at. And what the Giallo did with that format was to take the murder sequences, to take the violence and the chaos that comes out of them, and make it overwhelm the very staid structure of that kind of Agatha Christie style mystery.
The relationship that the Giallo has with old murder mysteries goes back to the 1920s, and the Italian Milanese publisher Mondadori produced a series of very cheap, inexpensive paperbacks in a definitive yellow cover. And it became sort of a series that Mondadori are still producing today. And in this series were translations of Agatha Christie and Edgar Wallace and P.D. James and Conan Doyle, these kinds of classic mystery writers, translated into Italian and produced with these distinctive yellow titles. So the genre as a whole became known as Giallo. Giallo meaning yellow, in reference to the Mondadori covers.
I film gialli perché, cioè i miei ricordi partono a Mike Spillane. Mike Spillane è stato il mio scrittore che amavo più di tutti.
Looking at some of the 1940s film noir, you can see things like The Two Mrs. Carrolls or The Spiral Staircase, The Leopard Man. You can see all these things which they're struggling towards becoming the Giallo, which I suppose is it has to be an Italian art form. It is nothing else, although all its references are outside Italy, or many of its references are outside Italy. It would be impossible without, say, Agatha Christie, Cornell Woolrich, another great noir writer whose films were, Eyeball is a plagiarism of a Cornell Woolrich novel. Bird with the Crystal Plumage, a plagiarism of a Frederick Brown novel, The Screaming Mimi, which had been filmed in Hollywood already. You know, I think maybe we should scurry back and look at some of these old pulp novels, the David Goodises, the Cornell Woolrich's, Jim Thompson, whatever, and see how that feeds into. I think you couldn't have had Giallo without the German series of Edgar Wallace movies of the early 60s. But if you look at those films, you can see Giallo aborning.
Hitchcock obviously casts a large shadow on the thriller genre as a whole, all over the world. The influence of Hitchcock on the classic period of the Giallo throughout the 1970s is really down to the narrative itself, the intricacy of the plot, the centrality of the story within any of the Giallo films is just like the centrality of the story within any of Hitchcock's films. What Hitchcock was able to do, and that later Giallo filmmakers developed, was that recognition that within this very complex story, we needed to mislead the audience in certain ways, to play with the audience's expectations, in just the same way that Hitchcock did.
Una buona storia è una capacità di raccontare con la suspense alla Hitchcock, che tenga lo spettatore teso fino al finale.
People look a lot at Hitchcock as a kind of proto-Giallo filmmaker, which is interesting because all the people who made Giallo obviously knew Hitchcock backwards. They steal bits from him. I actually think that Michelangelo Antonioni is probably as important. If you look at L'Avventura and Blow Up, there is so much in there that basically Dario Argento was playing with for the rest of his career. I think it's probably the case that too many Giallo fans haven't seen enough Antonioni films to get quite how important they are.
Che cosa succede? Che in quegli anni lì c'è tutta una generazione che vuole fare scandalo in contemporanea. Nessuno ha il talento per emergere e diventare, che ne so, Madame Bovary piuttosto che l'amante delle Dicette o qualsiasi altra cosa. Però di fatto c'è una generazione che si ribella e ribellandosi irride a tutti quelli che sono le cose sacrali. Questa cosa qui, questa perdita dell'innocente è stata così traumatica, così violenta, che ancora adesso molti di quella generazione non hanno ancora metabolizzato la perdita della propria innocenza. Quindi tornano a rivedere dei film che non sono belli, non hanno rappresentato niente, ma che simbolicamente sono disturbanti.
What's happened with the Gialli is that really they started to turn up the volume on the psychosexual, psychopathological, fetishistic aspect of the story, and by the time we got to Dario, they happily dispensed with the police, with any kind of formal investigators, usually introduced an artist or a composer or someone who's trapped in the middle of the mystery instead, and compelled to unravel it.
There's an outsider, always, usually a tourist, often a writer, who's come to Italy for a holiday or they're working and they're witness to a murder. And then they often actually become a target of the killer, whoever that is.
Instead of giving us a regular whodunit or a crime story, slowly the story becomes less and less important, and the manic emotions and the sheer intensity of the pathological mental state of the killer takes over the movie.
Then they all have to have like this incredible style, this artiness that you don't expect. Suddenly from nowhere are the most beautiful, composed scenes of murder and mayhem that you would have ever seen, with everybody looking fabulous in furs and, designer clothes.
Il giallo mi porta a un fatto che non è realistico alcune volte, e io invece mi batto sempre per il cinema realistico, per cui il giallo, non solo il finale del giallo, allora che devo fare? E poi mi è difficile alcune volte capire, perché ci stanno, adesso i gialli sono talmente complicati che per individuare chi è l'assassino.
C'è un film The Facts of the Murder, che è un film di Pietro Germi, e quindi porta l'attenzione del pubblico sul giallo italiano. È il primo film, giallo italiano che ha un enorme successo di cassetta. Un paio d'anni dopo viene preso alla grande da Bava.
To see Bava as a post-Hitchcockian director is to recognize within Bava a lot of similar characteristics to Alfred Hitchcock. So the precision within the shot planning, the emphasis on the intricacy of the plot, the MacGuffin. These aspects which Hitchcock really started are picked up by Bava and made Italian within his films. So Hitchcock is clearly an influence within Bava, but Bava takes it in a different direction to Hitchcock.
A shattering, shivering, shocking experience. Blood and black lace.
Most people identify The Girl Who Knew Too Much by Mario Bava as the first Giallo film, because it was the first film that brought out the amateur detective, the exotic locations, the testimony oculare, the eyewitness.
It's one of the few Giallos that's in black and white, and it emphasized the film noir, I mean, Giallo always being a combination of film noir and horror, but most of the films tend to have a little bit more of one or the other. The Girl Who Knew Too Much emphasizes a little bit more of the film noir. And it's also one of the few that has the amateur sleuth or the witness being the woman. But it sets up almost every single trope that we then tend to see in the Giallo film. And Bava's really, part of that generation who's trying to work against neo-realism, and yet at the same time taking some stuff from neo-realism, the idea of the amateur in a strange situation, but still working against the establishment of the time. And so that was really the one that started the trend of doing these crime thrillers, and there really wasn't a history of that in Italy.
Mario Bava prima nel 62-63 fa The Evil Eye, La ragazza che sapeva troppo, che è molto interessante perché c'è proprio anche lì un uso dei luoghi romani, che anche questo Dario prenderà, perché c'è Piazza di Spagna, c'è Piazza Mincio, che poi Piazza Mincio del quartiere Coppedè diventerà una delle ambientazioni preferite di Dario, però la prima volta la si vede nel film La ragazza che sapeva troppo.
Mi interessava molto il suo cinema, infatti interessava anche a Fellini, anche ad altri autori, è interessato molto il suo tipo di cinema, così inventivo, pieno di idee.
Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace, to me, really is the beginning of the Giallo. Clearly, you can also see the roots of that form in The Girl Who Knew Too Much. But it's there, I think, in a very underdeveloped form, primarily because the visuals don't match the storytelling in the way that they do in Blood and Black Lace. In Blood and Black Lace, you begin to get that kind of visual extravagance, that use of color, just incredibly off-kilter sequences that are completely readable. You never don't know what's going on. But sequences are presented in a way that's incredibly Baroque and incredibly filled with visual flourishes.
Che è Sei donne per l'assassino, Blood and Black Lace, ci sono 6 sequenze di delitti che durano anche 8-9 minuti l'una, con l'assassino che cerca di prendere la vittima, scappa, la ferisce, lei scappa ancora, l'assassino la riprende finché la uccide. Cioè proprio la scena è solo quello, e poi in mezzo a legare queste 6 sequenze ci sono delle brevi scene dialogate col commissario di polizia, che sono girate in un modo molto sciatto, cioè si vede a Mario Bava, confermato anche da Lamberto, quei dialoghi, quelle scene col poliziotto che cercava, non gliene poteva fregare di meno, li ha tirate via, come si dice, girate in fretta, perché quello che gli interessava erano le 6 sequenze dei 6 delitti.
I don't remember seeing any maniac wear black leather gloves, except until I think Blood and Black Lace. I don't know how obvious that was for him. Did he just sort of say, oh, let's just put some gloves on, it looks creepy? If there was any major design behind it, I don't know. But it has become the real classic cliche of every single Giallo picture, that everyone has to put on the black gloves.
You expect, of course, the black-gloved killer. I mean, that's become a trope you just can't get away with. And that's in part because it's so perfectly visual. The Giallo is not the first place you saw killers wearing black gloves. It makes sense, right? You're going to wear gloves if you're not a moron and you're going to commit a terrible crime because you don't want to leave fingerprints. But that particular, and they look like black driving gloves in most cases, those very tight, very slim cut leather driving gloves have become a real part of the Giallo look, which is, of course, not a surprise because they're so stylish and so sleek that they could have been made to order for the aesthetic of that kind of film.
And of course, in Dario's case, he always wears them. He has to be the maniac. He will never let the actor wear those.
Clearly, Dario Argento looked at that movie and thought, I see in a completely new way I can take that.
Movies like Bava's Blood and Black Lace and Bay of Blood, which hugely influenced the American slasher genre. Friday the 13th and a lot of the other slashers, which take a lot of their ideas almost wholesale from the Gialli.
Everybody knows that there was a scene in Bay of Blood which was explicitly recreated in Friday the 13th Part 2.
Bay of Blood is much more of a slasher film than it is a Giallo, because it's really about everybody killing everybody else, and there is very little investigation.
E questo è il prototipo del thriller poi moderno, del thriller che poi Dario prende in mano. Dario si trova per caso tra le mani il romanzo La statua che urla. A me fu raccontato a suo tempo dalla moglie che glielo diede Bernardo Bertolucci. Bernardo Bertolucci aveva esordito con un film giallo, La Comare secca, e voleva fare un altro giallo. Quando aveva frequentato Dario per fare il film di Sergio Leone, parlando poi dei loro progetti, aveva dato in lettura a Dario La statua che urla. Dario se ne era innamorato, poi si era separato da Bertolucci, eccetera, però l'ha portato avanti. Bertolucci ha abbandonato quel progetto e Dario l'ha portato avanti. E ha scritto il copione dell'Uccello di cristallo.
With Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Dario Argento effectively created the modern Giallo film. He took aspects from Mario Bava, from Girl Who Knew Too Much, of the tourism dimension, the testimony oculare, as well as the amateur detective, and puts that alongside of other Bava stuff from Blood and Black Lace, like the killer's black gloves and the wide-brimmed hat, the brutality of the murders, the diversity of the different ways to kill somebody. He takes all of those things together and creates in 1970 Bird with the Crystal Plumage.
Bird with the Crystal Plumage is probably the first film that really sets out what most people know as Giallo, because most people know Giallo through Argento.
Yeah, perché ho cambiato, perché ho inserito forse più vigore, più forza nel racconto, lui era, Mario Bava era più leggero, forse era più delicato. Io invece ero più forte, più vigoroso, e allora forse questa forza ha fatto sì che il giallo è cambiato da allora.
Why I think it was so groundbreaking is because Dario was sort of leaning from two sort of separate genres. I mean, there were the German cremis that were very, very popular, even with Italian audiences. I mean, these were like very heavy Germanic thrillers, usually written by Edgar Wallace. In fact, that's why Edgar Wallace gets a mention on the German print of Bird with the Crystal Plumage, because they wanted it allied to that, even though it had nothing to do with it. So you got that coming out of that, which is like a very sort of like Schlager thriller, really, in a way. And then you've got the Italian side of it, which is very ornate, just very artistic, you know, very, very baroque. And I think the two married together really, really work. In Dario's case, I think he had an exceptional script. I mean, he'd really thought about it long and hard. I mean, he knew what to sort of like, he knew what he wanted. He knew the whole point about the two, you know, the killers right at the very beginning in the art gallery, and he swung it off from there.
I think what's so interesting about Dario's films is how he plays with memory, and so much of his early gialli are about, you know, what did I see? Something is wrong, something is off. You know, and finally realizing, okay, it wasn't the man who was the aggressor, it was the woman.
Sì, per esempio L'uccello dalle piume di cristallo forse è il film che più mi è piaciuto, è proprio tanto. L'uccello dalle piume di cristallo era proprio un giallo perfetto.
No, Argento è stato un mio allievo, gli ho insegnato io a fare il regista. Ha scritto il mio film La Legione dei Dannati, o Jack Palance, scritto sotto mia dettatura, a casa mia 3 mesi. Poi è venuto sul set di Orgasmo a guardare. Io non sono stato mai influenzato dai suoi film, perché io ho fatto tutti quei film gialli erotici, prima come Così dolce, così perversa, Paranoia, Orgasmo, e poi ho fatto Il coltello di ghiaccio, e nulla hanno a che vedere con i suoi film.
Whereas the German creamies were sexy because they had girls running around in underwear, I think in a case of Dario's thing, he put real sex and violence together in a way that no one had done before, and I think that's what was so startling at the time. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why everyone slavishly followed his lead.
Che poi infatti è il suo primo film, L'uccello di cristallo, che codifica, riassume, prendendo tutte queste cose, le mette insieme, poi Dario le interpreta a modo suo benissimo, E nasce questo film che poi dà il via col suo successo a tutto il filone.
Ma il mio film L'uccello dalle piume di cristallo fu subito successo, subito un grande successo. Ma perché c'era qualcosa di dentro di uno stile nuovo che il pubblico ha riconosciuto, che forse in Bava era più nascosto, invece qui era più palese, più comprensibile per tutti, per cui ebbe un grande successo. Fu anche al primo posto negli Stati Uniti, in America, fu al primo posto negli incassi per 2 o 3 settimane, quindi ebbe un successo mondiale, perché appunto il pubblico trovò forse un nuovo stile, un nuovo modo di raccontare.
L'uccello di cristallo uscì a New York e fu un grossissimo successo, inaspettato, totalmente inaspettato. E di colpo il produttore italiano, distributore italiano, coproduttore tedesco disse subito facciamo un altro film, Giallo. E lì poi è nato il filone, perché il secondo film, che era Il gatto a 9 code, fu invece un successo enorme anche in Italia.
I thought Cat o' Nine Tails really built on everything that Dario did in Bava the Crystal Plumage. I think the murders are actually spectacular in that film. I mean, the train, in front of the train, everything about it is just brilliant. I mean, and right to the very ending. I can actually still remember watching it in the cinema when his hands slide down the elevator cables, thinking, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. And I just loved the whole jargon, this whole XYY chromosome thing. I mean, it made perfect sense to me that, that the psychosis would be stamped in our DNA somewhere along the line. I mean, unfortunately, of course, with that film it doesn't really play that fair with who actually the murderer is. It's like suddenly, oh, it's him, and you go, oh, really? Who's that? But I mean, whereas at least with Bava the Crystal Plumage, you did have a pretty good idea of working it out. You could actually see where that was coming from. Whereas Cat o' Nine Tails really was sort of like, well, who cares? It was all about the style. It was more about the style. But don't forget, Dario really was sort of forced into doing that movie, and the film company said to him, "We want a film exactly the same, so do it." And so he sort of did feel quite constrained by that. I mean, it works sort of up to a point, and all that sort of like great sort of scientific machinery, which of course comes out also in Four Flies on Grey Velvet, which I absolutely adore, mainly because the music in that I think is some of the best music. Another reason why Giallo films are so fabulous, because in all the scenes of violence you get the most incredibly beautiful music, usually by Ennio Morricone, but we can put up with somebody else.
I think of the way that Four Flies on Grey Velvet closes with the slow motion decapitation, ultra slow motion, beautiful theme by Ennio Morricone. It's just pure cinema and audio.
And Mimsy Farmer, I think, is pretty good. She punches that across really well, and of course you've got that great ending. So I mean, every film, it's called the Animal Trilogy, but to be honest with you, that's just because of the names in the title. But I think that you can see a natural progression all the way through those 3 films, and how he was experimenting with camera technique, with technology. And in that day, if it had a Dario Argento name on the film, people would flock to see it, because he was the Giallo man you went to. All the others can sort of like have pretense, but he was the one who did it.
Dopo il successo dei primi 2 film, soprattutto dopo il successo del Gatto a 9 code, che fu veramente fortissimo in Italia, finì quell'anno tra i primi 10 maggiori incassi in assoluto. Molti produttori cominciavano a pensare giriamo dei gialli, perché il giallo si poteva girare in ambiente contemporaneo.
Among the annals of the abnormal, there is no more erotic a nightmare than the strange story of lizard in a woman's skin.
Dove ci sono stati diversi film interessanti. Anche Fulci ha fatto dei gialli.
Fulci crafted some beautiful gialli, Don't Torture a Duckling, Murder to the tune of 7 Black Notes, Lizard in a Woman's Skin.
Lizard in a Woman's Skin adds in, of course, the supernatural with the woman in the dream sequence, and the woman being somewhat passive.
The music by Ennio Morricone is amazing. It's totally psychedelic, and the editing is just wow.
I made a film called Don't Torture the Duckling, up in the mountains in Puglia, in a small little town Lucio Fulci was very extravagant, an extravagant director, and sort of one who also had a tendency to lose his temper. But he was technically really well prepared.
Well, Fulci is a lot more of a brute in a way than Argento, and he's much patchier, at least his earlier career was, and that there's only really a few great Fulci movies, and then there's a whole bunch of other ones which are kind of a little bit more negligible. But Fulci did make some of the very best giallos. Don't Torture a Duckling is a very, very interesting movie. But yeah, Lizard and Woman's Skin and Duckling stand up very, very well. Duckling, I thought, was very ahead of its time, and it obviously squarely points the finger of blame at the Catholic Church and at Italian society. And I very much like the way that Don't Torture a Duckling recruits the town witch and the paparazzi journalist and the town slut who's trying to make her dope deal as the good guys. And then it's the priest and the censor who is obviously the force of evil who is murdering the children. And that's very, very intriguing.
Actually, I prefer in films to be the bitch. I'm not the sweet little girl. I'm the sweet, nice one, which I did lots of. But as I say today, give me a part where I can be rough, tough, bitchy, mean, and everything else. And I'll love it because I get to put my teeth into it and because it's the opposite of me.
You know, if we think of the priest in any sort of traditional community, Italian community, as having a privileged position, you know, not necessarily wealthier, although that may have been part of it, but certainly a position of respect. You know, that the clergy should be afforded some kind of respect. Lucio Fulci and the other filmmakers who use killer priests within their films are being a little bit naughty. You know, it's like, you know, here's the priest who's, you know, one of the top people within our community. Let's make him, you know, the killer in the film as the great reversal. We would never suspect a priest.
It's one of the few giallos set in the rural space. Everything else is always in a city. And this one, of course, is set in the rural space, and it involves the death of children. So he's really pushing the boundaries. I mean, I suppose it's technically a giallo because of the whole serial killer, you know, amateur detective, you know, and the journalist working together to try to solve the mystery, but it's a bit atypical because of the rural setting.
I don't think Don't Torture a Duckling is a million miles away from one of the best Argento giallos. Again, it's just the sumptuous production, the locations, camera work, everything, the music, everything just gels. And I think really, when you're watching for me, when I'm watching a giallo, if one of those ingredients is missing, it just doesn't sort of hit all the right buttons for me.
Cioè ci vuole anche la location, penso, per fare il giallo. Per esempio, non trovo indicata Roma per fare un giallo, invece trovo, che ne so, altre città italiane più gotiche. Il gotico ci serve a Edimburgo, serve il giallo, forse a Torino serve il giallo, Venezia, Rosso Shocking era un giallo bellissimo. Ci vogliono gli angoli, ci vogliono i vicoli, ci vogliono le strade strette, ci vogliono le scale buie, ci vogliono tante cose per fare i gialli.
Agli inizi si faceva quasi soltanto a Roma, fuori Roma non si girava quasi mai, perché non c'erano i mezzi, non era facile girare fuori Roma. Bisognava arrivare con tutti i nostri attrezzi, con i nostri camion, con tutti i truck, no? Era molto complesso. Poi però invece io sono stato il primo a andare via da Roma e andare a cercare delle nuove location, e così ho trovato Torino, che è molto magica come città, è veramente una città fantastica, con delle architetture bizzarre, complesse, e così ho portato il cinema, appunto il giallo, anche in altre città.
Ci sono stati diversi autori interessanti, anche se non erano autori specializzati, cioè Dario è giallo, diciamo, è sempre vissuto sul giallo, poi ha fatto l'oro, ma insomma sempre giallo. Gli altri autori erano registi professionisti, che però si sono cimentati anche col giallo, alcuni con ottimi risultati. Sergio Martino ha fatto dei film gialli molto riusciti, molto ben fatti, ne ha fatti diversi anche, tra l'altro, sempre bene.
Sergio Martino is responsible for some of my favorite Giallo films. The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, Torso, which also has a great connection with the slasher films, and even to some extent the Rosemary's Baby-inspired conspiracy witchcraft film, All the Colors of the Dark, are really good as well. All of these films are shining examples of what the genre can actually do with cinematic storytelling.
All the Colors of the Dark has my favorite line in any movie ever, where the lead is talking to her neighbor. You know, she's been having a hard time. She's moved into this apartment building. She's just having a tough time. And then the neighbor says, "You know what really helped me? Going to a black mass." And the lead says, "Oh, okay." And then they go to a black mass. Like, black masses happen all the time.
Sergio Martino made some incredible gialli which just threw in, with a certain amount of spurious psychological motivation, threw in all sorts of sexual angst, which is an excuse really to undress Edwige Fenech a lot, which was good.
How far can you go before your nerves break, before your heart stops, before your eyes leave your body? Eyeball.
Umberto Lenzi forse, secondo me, è un regista più discontinuo, nel senso che faceva dei bei film, poi ne alternava degli altri meno belli, però insomma è un altro professionista che aveva già fatto dei gialli in precedenza degli anni 60. Quelli degli anni 60 erano abbastanza noiosi, ma quelli degli anni 70 invece erano gialli interessanti.
Ma l'unico film che dicano che è ispirato a Dario Argento sarebbe il Sette orchidee macchiate di rosso, il che non è vero, e te lo spiego subito. Nei film di Dario, che come regia sono eccellenti, specialmente Profondo Rosso, che è un capolavoro, come regia, come sceneggiatura sono pieni di buchi. Gli ultimi addirittura la critica li distrugge come film puerili inutili. Però in tutti i suoi film c'è sempre un uomo vestito di nero, va bene, col cappellaccio, tutto vestito di nero, col guanto nero, che uccide la ragazza. C'è anche nel mio film, Sette orchidee macchiate di rosso, solo che nel mio film è un prete, per cui doveva essere vestito in quel modo. Ed è di una forza di tensione enorme. Lo stesso film di Hitchcock.
Lenzi's Eyeball as well. I remember that one, loads of tourists on a coach stopping around somewhere and having their eyes stabbed out. And I think wasn't there also in a European cut of that a famous shower scene, which was, you know, a bit of a homage to Psycho, but in Technicolor gore.
Ciascuno ha portato un contributo, poi bisogna tenere presente che in quel periodo, quando usciva un film e aveva successo, film diciamo medio-basso costo, quindi poteva essere copiato facilmente, e aveva successo, il produttore diceva: vabbè, lì ammazzano 5 persone, noi ammazziamone 10 e così compensiamo con i 5 morti in più, magari il fatto che non è bello come quell'altro, però la gente vede tanti morti ed è contenta, per cui c'è stata un'escalation di violenza, diciamo, di sangue. Anche Dario l'ha fatta, nel primo film i morti erano fatti in un modo, nel secondo già erano più forti, nel terzo dovevamo superare i morti di quello precedente, e così è successo anche con gli altri registi, insomma. La violenza e il sangue sono andati aumentando in questi film, finché sono arrivati alle soglie dell'horror.
Ormai il giallo per noi è sempre troppo insanguinato, troppo macello, no? Per cui diventa uno splatter per me, diventa un horror. Quello splatter non mi interessa, non mi piace.
There are some really good ones. I mean, my favourite outside of Argento's is, I think, Massimo Dallamano's What Have You Done to Solange? I think that is absolutely brilliant because he actually takes a lot of Dario's style. You can almost actually mistake that for a Dario film in many places.
What Have They Done to Solange? I find a very sad and painful film. It's really trying to create different emotions other than horror and revulsion. Linked with that, I find, quite a sad giallo is Who Saw Her Die, which is about a child murderer in Venice. Watch Me When I Kill. It goes by a variety of names. There's also the cat with jade eyes, I think it's also known as. What I like about Watch Me When I Kill is how it brings in Italy's experiences during World War II, particularly as a fascist regime in its own right, and the retribution for some of its wartime atrocities, I find is a very interesting theme within that film.
There is one I like very much, which is called L'arma, l'ora, il movente. And there is a very unique atmosphere in it. It's not very violent, but it's there is one scene in a restaurant where they go to have a lunch together, a woman and a man, and they finish to make love in that restaurant. It's totally surprising.
I love Aldo Lardo's Short Night of Glass Dolls. I think that's absolutely brilliant. And I adore Strip Nude for Your Killer. I think that is Andrea Bianchi's. I adore that because it's just so insanely sleazy.
I think Strip Naked for Your Killer is the one where basically the motivation, and here's another spoiler, is that a woman's friend died during a botched abortion or something. They sort it out. So at the end, Edwige Fenwick's boyfriend says to her, well, we don't want to risk that, do we? And there's a freeze frame of him attempting to sodomize her. So it's like, this can be a classy genre, this can be a very scuzzy genre.
The names were so lurid, it almost drew you into, what the hell is that about? Death Steps in the Dark, Death Laid an Egg, Death Carries a Cane. I mean, if they came out with, I don't know, maybe a typical US title, they may not have the following or the interest that they originally got.
You knew the title of the Giallo was going to be kind of lengthy, and would nearly always, or more often than not, include an animal. I like the way that there's this weird flora and fauna thing going on in the titles, that there's nearly always some kind of signifying animal, Don't Torture a Duckling, Cat o' Nine Tails, which is never in the movie.
But then again, that's reflective of the strangeness of the Giallo. It's reflective of the strangeness of the narrative and how all the different, semantics of, mise-en-scène and music are put together. It is in its way reflective, not so much perhaps of the actual story, but of what they're trying to do with the form.
The longer the title, the more we wanted to see it. I mean, you say Lizard in a Woman's Skin, like everything about those films, Red Queen kills 7 times, My Advice is a Locked Room and Only You Have the Key, and Why Those Strange Drops of Red on the Body of Jennifer. I mean, these are just brilliant titles. And of course, the classic, which is, of course, The Bodies Show Signs of Sexual Violence, which Sergio Martino directed, and of course that was turned by the Americans into just Torso, which I thought sounded a bit lame, really. But I mean, anyway, but these endlessly long titles, Death Walks in High Heels, Paolo Cavara's, Black Belly the Tarantula. Oh, I just love it. I mean, there's so many of those. I mean, and I think those titles were really evocative of what that whole period is. The Bloodstained Butterfly, oh, just fabulously. Case of the Scorpion's Tail, come on, there are so many. God, it goes on. Fifth Chord, we could go on forever.
There were lots of movies about 7 dead in the cat's eye, the cats with silk shawls, the crazy stuff about animals, because Argento had such success with his original trilogy of Bird with Crystal Plumage, Cat of Nine Tails, and Four Flies on Grey Velvet.
The actual title is like the ultimate MacGuffin and red herring. It means it's completely meaningless, really, because you're thinking, why is this called this? And then you get to that one bit where it says, oh, there's a bird in the zoo, and like it's got that call on the phone. And so you think, oh, right, it's that sort of random.
My personal favorite is Red Cats in a Glass Maze. There are no red cats, there is no glass maze. It has nothing to do with red cats or a glass maze.
I love the fact that the titular animal is always missing. And it's often the absence of the titular animal which points to the murderer's identity. That we get the sound of the bird, the crystal plumage, and the bird of the crystal plumage. An actual crystal bird doesn't turn up until it's used as the murder weapon in Suspiria. Four Flies in Grey Velvet, again, the flies are on the medallion and point to the killer's identity. The sound of the bird of the crystal plumage leads them to find the killer. In Don't Torture a Duckling, it's the toy duck, or at least the missing head of the toy duck that leads them to find the killer. And Dario himself has obviously for years been obsessed with this weird idea of animal detectives, of the animal as the thing, the animal from the title is the thing which solves the crime. A lot of the time it's the chimpanzee with the razor blade kills Dario at the end of Phenomena. The girl uses flies to try and find the killer. Even in his later work like Sleepless, Max von Sydow is being advised by a parrot. In opera, ravens are used to identify the killer in the audience because ravens have a very strong memory. But the way that the titular beast or the bit of flora and fauna somehow is the thing which solves the whole case. It's the one little crucial detail, but at the same time it's very seldom in the actual movie. I mean, you won't find an actual iguana and the iguana with the tongue of fire, or an actual scorpion of two tails, or whatever it is that's luring you in. But yeah, it's an extraordinary bestiary of kind of non-existent animals.
Beyond shock.
What was that?
Beyond horror. Into total terror.
In Deep Red, Argento is able to fully actualize his vision, his artistic vision, in creating a gory, complicated murder mystery thriller horror film.
The first three, the animal movies, are really interesting and strong, and they're concerned very much with their stories. They're kind of absurd, but they make sense. Deep Red, which actually is probably the best constructed of Argento's thrillers, it's one of the better mysteries. It is sort of a culmination of that particular style, but it's allowing the irrational and the magical into his world.
I think it brings together everything that Giallo is, all the different facets. It has the outsider, in this case David Hemmings, who of course has a history in Italian film with his work in Blow Up. He witnesses a murder, but there's something he can't quite figure out what it is that he saw, and it has to do with a piece of art, of course, with a painting, which is, of course, actually turns out to be a mirror. And he has this best friend who may or may not be involved, and there is something of the supernatural, which Argento brought in. Nobody else had really done that. That was his thing. It would figure more prominently in later films, but he brings in a bit of the supernatural, though, of course, there's still the rational ending. And it is, again, this, David Hemmings starting to investigate, sort of alongside the police, but not really, and him becoming a target. And of course, the killer ends up being the psychopathic woman.
You are like the detective because you watch the movie, and at the end you see who is the killer, and so you rewind to watch if at the beginning there is really the killer inside the image, and it's just like an interactive cinema.
I talk to scholars, I talk to film historians, I talk to the fans. They think Profondo Rosso Deep Red is the best one he ever made. And you can see why they think that. I mean, because it has, I think, the cleverest reveal of any film that Dario ever did. And I think it's brilliantly done, and I'm still surprised no one copies it to this day, but it's been pretty much unique to that film.
You can see him picking up a lot of the skills, camera-wise, that he would later sort of rely on for Tenebrae and going as far as opera.
All those scenes with David Hemmings and Daria Nicolodi in her car, in which he's being constantly humiliated by the seat that makes him look like he's a foot shorter than she is, and her little jabs at him in those scenes, which very much tie into the overall theme of that film, which has a lot to do with emasculation and about the way in which different men deal with different expectations of how men are supposed to behave.
It is so shocking in so many places, and I mean, and even when you look at it now, you can't believe that it actually got away with it at the time. I think the hatchet cutting in the throat, I mean, it's just amazing with the glass. It's a brilliant effect. Dario, when he does that sort of stuff, is peerless. You cannot get anybody better than him at Giallo, and so many people try.
Music in the Giallo film is so important because often in these films, the narrative really becomes quite secondary. The plots often don't make sense. There are tons of holes, lots of, displacement of logic in them because it's more about how the film is shot and how the music is. And I think with Argento especially bringing in, people like Goblin to do to do it. He was trying to modernize, he was trying to keep up to date and reach a younger audience who is more interested in rock and roll. You know, they might not be interested in a crime thriller per se, but they all, you know, or they would, and you add in the rock music, and that brings more of the contemporary, you know, for the audience, because so much of Giallo was counterculture, it was youth culture, and Argento really had his finger on the pulse of that.
They say a movie is 50% sound. I think in some cases it's 75% of the movie. You watch Tenebrae, Suspiria, Profondo Rosso, any of the great Argento movies, any of the great Italian giallos whatsoever, take the music out and you're left with something that works, but there's something about Goblin that really, you know, just raised the bar for Dario.
And in Deep Red, it was going to be Giorgio Gaslini, who still is credited with some of the stuff, but then it segued into the Goblins.
We all know that, you know, Giorgio Gaslini wrote a score for Deep Red, and it was going to be augmented by Goblin music until Dario suddenly realised that actually the Goblin music should be the preeminent factor in the fore of that, and that's one of the reasons. And without knowing it, of course, he minted one of the greatest soundtracks ever. Put Goblin on everyone's lips and made everyone take note of progressive rock being part of, you know, horror film history. I suppose, you know, depending on how you look at like Tubular Bells or stuff like that, I suppose there was a precedent prior to this. And I always remember that Dario wanted Pink Floyd to sort of score Deep Red up to a point, but then of course they weren't interested because they were mega fabulous and successful, and why would they go to Italy to do this? But I mean, Deep Red, I think, is Goblin's finest hour. It really is. I mean, you can never forget that music once you've heard that, I think.
They did wonderful scores, and then under various billings, you know, Simonetti, Morante, Pignatelli, or as the Goblins, they scored so many of these movies, and they were just right for the way that those movies were at that time. I mean, when the Italian movie industry went off on a disco tip, the Goblins were making disco soundtracks. It's really quite incredible.
You can hide from Suspiria.
I remember talking to somebody who saw Suspiria way before anybody else at a festival, having seen Argento's earlier movies, and sitting through the first half of Suspiria, assuming there'd be an explanation. Assuming, yeah, that there would have been somebody outside the window on a window cleaner's harness, and that they had drugged the dog, and that the cult was a sort of a political one. And then gradually dawning on him that no, this wasn't going to happen. This was a supernatural horror film.
I've always felt that Giallo is a good description of Suspiria because, again, it's stylish, it's beautifully shot, it's technically magnificent, and it is a whodunit, even if the answer to the question whodunit is a witch. To me, Suspiria is a Giallo.
Perché in realtà Dario, con Profondo Rosso, inizia a muoversi verso il fantastico, l'orrore, l'immagine pura. Subito dopo fa Suspiria. Suspiria entra nell'orrore, entra alla grande in maniera clamorosa. Poi fa Inferno, che è la seconda parte di Suspiria. Quindi Dario in quel punto non voleva più fare il giallo. Non voleva fare il giallo con l'assassino, voleva andare in quella direzione. Tant'è vero che Dario ha scritto La terza madre, allora, una storia ancora più cupa, ancora più disperata, ambientata a New York, e con un finale drammatico, negativo, eccetera, che concludeva, diciamo, quel... Il problema è stato che Inferno è andato male. Il box office di Inferno è stato molto deludente. Per cui il padre di Dario, Salvatore, che era il produttore insieme a Dario, ci sono state delle riunioni e è stato deciso: lasciamo perdere questo tipo di storia. Hanno cominciato a insistere con Dario: devi tornare a fare il giallo, devi tornare a fare il giallo, devi tornare a fare il giallo. E a questo punto Dario si è convinto che gli conveniva tornare a fare il giallo, per cui Tenebrae non nasce dalla sua voglia di tornare a fare il giallo, è un indotto.
Tenebrae is such a reaction to the work that came before. It's obviously a return to form in that he's gone back to his Giallo roots, but at the same time it's a huge reaction against Inferno, in that it's almost a negation of where he was going with Suspiria and Inferno, where his work had become extremely gothic, the lighting had become very, very expressionistic, a supernatural element had entered the stories, which had also become totally illogical and completely sort of random and poetic. And with Tenebrae, all that is cleared away. Suddenly all the Gothic edifices are replaced with sterile concrete and clean, shiny surfaces. Tenebrae is a film with almost no darkness in it at all, despite the title. It's an extremely bright, clean movie. He very intentionally takes the Mother of Tears at the beginning of the movie and Anna Peroni and not only brutally stabs her, but shoves pages of the book into her mouth, which seemed to be at the time a way of saying, I will never make Mother of Tears, and we're going to move in this direction instead. All the way through Dario's work, some part of his work feels like Poe's Imp of the Perverse, like the murderer who has gotten away with a crime but can't help flaunting it or advertising to the police. And that there's something in Tenebrae which is really pointing the finger at himself. For the first time in Dario's work, he seems to be identifying the true danger or the true evil as actually the author of the work. And it is kind of a confessional piece. And Tenebrae literally starts with the physical destruction of the text at the beginning, with the book being hurled into the flames. And it does, in that respect, yeah, it's a kind of a weird confession.
The music was amazing, and the directing. I used to watch a lot of slasher before Tenebrae, and there was a real cinematographic point of view on directing. It wasn't a recipe, like you have just people who are going to get killed. It was art about the architecture, the way he filmed the space, the way he filmed the murders, the way he filmed the women. For me in Giallo, women are the canvas and the murderer is the artist. So it's like a happening, murder becomes a happening. In Tenebrae you have that woman with the blood go on the wall.
E poi il colore è importante, uno studio sul colore, sulla rappresentazione del colore, uno stile di ripresa, uno stile di eleganza.
The beautiful women are murdered, and murdered quite viciously. In many ways, far more viciously than his previous, giallos, serious like knives and glass and everything.
It's so super stylish. I love the way it looks. It's got a really clever conceit lying in the middle. How can two people be in one place? So there's that. It's really sort of like quite well acted. I mean, Anthony Franciosa, I think, actually is terrific in it. And it's got the usual Dario set pieces, which is so brilliant. It really upsets me that people today don't see how technically brilliant some of these scenes are, because nowadays, of course, it's just CGI and you can do anything. But, the camera crawling over the roof murder in its day was just breathtaking. And it took Dario's style and technique to a new level.
Tenebrae, of course, has that fantastic, fantastic scare when the guy bends down and you see the killer behind him. That's one of the all-time great scares.
He's really making efforts to keep the audience guessing. You don't know really until the last minute that it is the man who is the killer, because he's also the outsider, the amateur sleuth. And you wonder the whole time, was he really aware? Did he have a split personality? And at the end, is he really dead?
In the Giallo, there is somebody who is very clearly the person you are supposed to suspect. And again, after a few of them, well, that is not the person who did it, except that every once in a while it is. In Tenebrae, for example. I mean, he is Peter Neal is the person you should suspect for every reason. And look at that. He's not the only person who did it, but he is completely guilty both prior to the things that happen during the course of the film and in the things that happen near the end of the film. And poor John Steiner, of course, takes up the center of it as Cristiano Berti. And that is a hilarious performance. John Steiner is not a great actor, and the dubbing is not fabulous. But there's something about his nervousness at a certain point that actually becomes quite compelling, I think.
You know, there's a sentence in a Conan Doyle book. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Bellissime che c'erano dei film precedenti. Il cambio dell'assassino a metà in realtà confonde le idee e basta, e sembra uno stratagemma, insomma, messo lì perché non sapeva, se no tutti avevano già capito tutto, insomma.
People do think it is a bit of a cheat when they do get to the explanation, don't they? But I just think that doesn't matter, because you end up with that incredible sort of like mounting hysteria, the blood splatter, the non-stop screaming. I think it's Daria Nicolodi's finest hour, because I think she's actually brilliant in it. Okay, it's Teresa Ross's voice, but she's still acting it out.
I think that the way that the mystery turns around in Tenebrae, it feels final to me. It feels like an indictment of the artist. It feels like a suggestion that, all this stuff really, is bad for you.
Tenebrae is about human perversion and its effects on society. And I'd like to know how you see the effects of deviant behavior on our lives.
Argento has always argued that movie violence does not cause real-life violence. Life does not imitate violent art. But the peculiar thing is that although characters in Tenebrae say that, what seems to happen at the end of the movie is that life has imitated violent art. It has recapitulated stuff in Peter Neal's novel, Tenebrae. There's always a work of art in Argento's movie. There's two in Tenebrae. There's the novel, and at the end there's a huge sculpture that penetrates and kills the killer. So there's this old idea about art. Oscar Wilde said that art was for the well-to-do was what crime was for the poor. It was a way of obtaining extraordinary sensations. And there's a quote from John Huston in a Lucio Fulci movie, Murder Rock, where he says that crime is the perverted expression of an artistic desire. So Argento is always comparing art and crime, and the argument seems to be, no, it doesn't cause violence. But in Tenebrae, seems to suggest it does, but of course Tenebrae is only a movie, and movies don't cause real-life violence, so it's very self-reflective, it's very postmodern.
It's a movie in which there are a lot of glittering surfaces, but nothing that's under those surfaces is what you think it will be, starting with the girl in the red shoes, who is of course not even a girl. So it's a fascinating movie, and it gives you a lot to think about and a lot to make you believe that, that wasn't just a horrible, gory, violent, misogynistic movie that I should feel really bad for enjoying. That's a movie that really is taking the tropes of the genre, twisting them, and yet still making them function perfectly within that generic context.
I've often wished I could go back and look at Dario's formative years, at his childhood and what was happening to him in puberty. Like David Hemmings, I'd like to go through his clown drawings from school because I have the sensation that he keeps harking back to some incident or something that happened a long time ago that's clearly influenced him.
Io sono un appassionato di Freud, secondo me senza Freud non ci sarebbe niente della letteratura e del cinema attuale, assolutamente. Lui ha cambiato il modo di vedere il mondo proprio. Io sono proprio un devoto di Freud. Infatti quando vado a Vienna al Festival della Biennale sempre vado a fare un pellegrinaggio alla casa di Freud, che c'è lì dove c'è il suo divano, il suo coach, c'è tutto, è bellissimo ed è molto emozionante.
You can always read Freud into any horror film. Freud is the basis of all horror film, the idea of psychoanalysis, because especially the serial killer, you always discover they've had some kind of great trauma, psychological trauma in their childhood, which made them become the serial killer.
Clearly, the Giallo is the most Freudian genre ever. You know, it's the most phallocentric, displacement-oriented genre, I think, that I have ever run across, and that includes Westerns, and Westerns are pretty intense on that front, and it includes a lot of the noir films, which also are very much about anxieties, about sexuality, particularly about men's anxieties.
Poi c'è la presenza femminile, che è molto importante nel giallo, la presenza femminile, donne buone, donne cattive, tutti i tipi di femminilità, però la femminilità è molto importante.
The antagonists are always women in the first Dario movies. This starts off with Bird of the Crystal Plumage, and very frequently the killer is identified with the mother, which really locks in with deep red, and then is kind of more heavily stylized with Suspiria and the idea of the three mothers and the mother of darkness, but the maternal figure is very definitely the force of evil and the thing which motivates the earlier Dario movies. It's also very clear that the protagonist in these early films is really Dario, that Tony Musante through Michael Brandon are all kind of versions of the young Dario, the young artist as he'd like to see himself as a pop star, as getting inexorably dragged into this mess, usually because of his family, usually because of reasons that he can't fully comprehend. Nearly always there's this final confrontation with the mother who has to be destroyed and overcome in some way. So I think again there's a slightly confessional aspect to it. I don't think it's until killing the Mother of Tears in Tenebrae that Dario realizes that he may be the problem. But Tenebrae is the one where for the first time we realize the killer is actually the author, he's a man. And then things start to change. There's some phenomena which is kind of a divorce movie, and where it's really the family and Dario and the kid which is the problem. But then very rapidly after that, in the latter part of Dario's career, it completely changes. Suddenly Asia starts becoming the lead. The lead is no longer the young Dario, but is suddenly his daughter the whole time. And all of a sudden the killer or the threat is always male. In the second half of Dario's career, we feel that it's him or the father figure that's really the problem, and Asia is constantly trying to kill her father or escape from the male influence in one movie after another, which is makes Tenebrae into this weird watershed moment where it really started to, for me, get a lot more personal.
Why do you despise women so much? Women as victims, ciphers, the male heroes with their hairy macho bullshit. How can you say it isn't?
Yeah, okay, the depiction of women in Yali is something that, I mean, maybe we can admire the way that women become central characters, but their feelings are privileged. But there is also a tendency to cut them up in little bits.
There are a handful of guys that get killed in these movies, but it's mainly the female form. There's the ciphers there of male aggression, male lust, and that is what the viewer is wanting to see. It's beautiful young women, to coin Dario's phrase. He'd much prefer to kill a beautiful woman than an ugly bloke or an ugly woman. I mean, I guess as cinema that sells, because cinema is audio and visual, and to have a beautiful woman up there on screen, getting run around, getting stabbed, blood everywhere, that kind of sold, and that was a staple ingredient of the Italian Giallo.
You certainly expect women in peril, although you expect that in most horror films, in most thrillers, in most mysteries, where women are put in peril. And that's something that people who don't like Gialli don't like a lot. There's a persistent accusation or perception that these films are misogynistic, that they are movies made by people who hate women. And certainly in the case of Argento, I can say, I know for a fact, Dario doesn't hate women. It's not his temperament, it's not his nature, and it's not the way he sees the kind of films he's making, although I'm not blind to the fact that you could certainly read them that way. You can read Tenebrae that way. You can read Deep Red that way, certainly. Bad things happen to a lot of women.
Raccontare le donne in tutte le loro apparizioni, sono specialista in raccontare le donne. Quasi tutti i miei film sono protagoniste, sono donne. Pensiamo ad esempio a mia figlia che ha fatto 5 film con me, Asia. Perché quando ero ragazzo, quando ero molto giovane, mia mamma era una famosa fotografa ed era fotografa di artisti, di divi, ed era specializzata in donne, in rappresentazioni di volti femminili. E allora io quando finivo la scuola, che era vicina al suo studio, andavo nel suo studio e poi tornavamo a casa insieme, e quindi io passavo delle ore in questo studio e vedevo queste donne, attrici bellissime come Sofia Loren, come Claudia Cardinale, meravigliose, che si truccavano, si preparavano, e poi dopo mia mamma che gli metteva le luci esatte, perché era molto difficile, complicato fare le luci, e faceva queste fotografie bellissime. E così mi è rimasto nella mente del modo di raccontare il volto femminile, il corpo femminile. Infatti ero anche perché io ero molto piccolo, ero ragazzino, e queste famose attrici, per loro ero come fossi un oggetto, e quindi si spogliavano davanti a me tranquillamente, senza pensare che provocavano nel mio animo dei sentimenti fortissimi di emozione, quindi ho conosciuto molto bene le donne e così le rappresento nei miei film quasi sempre.
The intriguing part about his work is he's a very feminine director, in that Dario concentrates on things that most male directors don't notice. He concentrates on wallpaper, on lipstick, on fingernails, on handbags, accessories, and things which regular male directors might easily overlook. There is something very weirdly feminine and yet childlike in Dario's work, which for me stops it from being overtly misogynistic.
You cheap little hooker. I wouldn't come near you right now if my life depended on it.
If you look at a more recent film that Argento made, The Card Player, he's got a girl strapped to a railway line, and he couldn't be more obviously saying, look, it goes back to the perils of Pauline. It's only a movie convention. Don't take it too seriously. Please don't go out and kill anybody.
I certainly am really uncomfortable sometimes on a film-by-film basis by some of these movies. Less so with the Giallo than, say, the cannibal movies or some of the more gore-inflected pictures of the 80s. But it's certainly an issue that you can't really get away from.
I mean, Strip Nude for Your Killer is famous for having the three of them totally naked, the three girls totally naked, wandering around, being menaced by a murderer. That would never happen now. You could see all the violence, but you'd never see them naked all the way through. You just wouldn't. And I mean, so, yeah, I mean, yes, they are misogynistic. That was the time. That's always been the Italian way of dealing with that subject matter.
I have always been a person that did not be ashamed of her body. Well, thank God it was a good one. But therefore, I was proud of it, happy to show it. It didn't bother me.
The New York Ripper by Lucio Fulci is probably deemed to be the last word on Giallo misogyny, but there is a sense in which it's an overblown black comedy. It's like just taking the most outre elements of this genre and just pushing them in your face, saying, how do you like that?
Era sempre la stessa troupe. Si fidava dei suoi collaboratori, Rosario Prestopino, De Rossi, Salvati la fotografia, eccetera, e facevo sempre lo stesso trucco. Quindi qualunque fosse lo spunto iniziale, alla fine ti ritrovavi che c'era sempre lo stesso trucco.
I think Fulci just went farther with body horror and again recognized that audiences like to see women's breasts on screen. So I think he was just going with that. He was going with what he knew the audience wanted, but still pushing the boundaries of Giallo and really moving more into horror. In the case of this film, getting as soft porn as he was legally able to.
Okay, well, when you look at something like Whatever Happened to Solange, where all the women who are killed with a knife up the vagina, or New York Ripper, yes. It's sort of hard to look at those and say they're not misogynistic. Personally, I think you have to embrace the Giallo in all its weirdness and its misogyny and take it for what it is. So I love Giallos, misogynistic or not. I think they're crazy and wonderful and bloody, and they've got some of the most amazing random plot twists ever.
Il giallo, la stagione d'oro del giallo, secondo me, è da un maledetto imbroglio del 1958 fino al Profondo Rosso 75. Fino a lì c'è un crescendo proprio di qualità, di sorprese, di violenza, di bellezza dei film, mi pareva. Dopo, in tutti i film gialli, con qualche rara eccezione, comincia una discesa, o soprattutto comincia a essere evidente la difficoltà nell'inventare. Con poche eccezioni tutti tendono a ripetere, anche Dario, a ripetere se stessi e a proporre soluzioni improbabili, perché per esempio o mischiare i generi, no? Fenomena mischia il soprannaturale, il fantastico, che è un buon film, Fenomena, però mischia già diversi generi, non è più giallo puro.
What happens in the later years is I think Argento moves away from the film noir of Giallo and far more into the horror, especially, you know, with Phenomena. It's really a supernatural horror film. I mean, it has some of the tropes. It has Jennifer Connelly as sort of the outsider trying to solve a mystery, but there's a monkey in it constantly, which feels very strange. And the mystery is supernatural because she has psychic powers. So it's not really a detective story. There's really no police involved. It really feels more like a supernatural horror film.
And also he was going through that heavy metal period, wasn't he, where you've got all the soundtracks, which he was thinking, you know, I can just see his thinking, oh yeah, let's put sort of heavy metal under this. I did it before with progressive rock, now I'll do it with this. I didn't think it quite worked there.
L'ultimo grande giallo di Dario, che è Opera. Opera è un film costosissimo, un film impegnativo, un film che ha delle scene strepitose.
For me, that was one of the last great hurrahs from Argento. It's got all his trademark, the visual, you know, the steady cam shots, the crane work, the plot line is as crazy as ever. It's got some amazing set pieces.
I think Opera is a really great film, a really beautiful film, and a film whose narrative is actually very clear. I mean, even when you come to the end, that some people find baffling, it's not baffling at all. It is the logical conclusion of everything that's led up to it.
Però è anche un film con dei difetti di costruzione di storia, cioè alla fine tutto il finale è impegnato sul fatto che la polizia ha trovato il cadavere dello sconosciuto e per 2 settimane non si è accorto che è un manichino, cioè in questi gialli, in mezzo anche a scene bellissime, ripeto, Opera è pieno di sequenze, alcune sequenze strepitose, però è pieno anche di buchi che quando vedi il giallo te lo fanno crollare in quei momenti. Comunque bisogna ricordare che Dario Argento, il suo successo che l'ha costruito dal 70 in avanti, fino a metà degli anni 80, però ogni suo film portava delle grosse novità, portava delle grosse idee. E negli anni 90 queste grosse idee, a parte l'inizio della sindrome di Stendhal, quell'idea della donna che entra dentro il quadro, che è molto bella, dopo 20 minuti non ha più niente a che fare col film, cioè ci sono problemi di scrittura, di storia in questi film che secondo me il pubblico ha avvertito. E questo è il motivo per cui non ha avuto il riscontro che aveva in passato, cioè io credo, le idee, la freschezza di idee di un uccello più di cristallo, di un gatto a 9 code, di un 4 mosche, per non parlare poi di Profondo Rosso, non c'è in questi film. La sindrome di Stendhal contraddice troppe regole del giallo e quindi non ha soddisfatto le attese del pubblico. Poi ha fatto Non ho sonno, diciamo. Non ho sonno è già un buon film che ha, per esempio, la sequenza iniziale sui treni è splendida. Quello è puro Dario Argento al massimo della sua abilità, eccezionale. C'è una cosa che a me non è piaciuta molto, questo parlare del nano perché il nano è il mostro, cioè per questo tipo di film. No? Vedo in questo tipo di film la gente si aspetta che l'assassino è un altro personaggio, senza tirare in ballo i sospetti su questa persona solo perché era piccolo, era nano.
We think, is it a dwarf? And then it turns out to be a child. And then later it's a machine. So again, that's sort of, changing the idea of the giallo, putting in all these red herrings. Well, red herrings have always been a part of giallo. But again, playing with the audience and playing with the idea of how the movie looks, as opposed to it making narrative sense.
Il Cartaio è un film che vuole aggiornarsi alle televisioni, ai giochi, però è già un film televisivo. Cioè ha quasi un taglio televisivo, non è quello che ci si aspetta da un film di Dario Argento.
People give Card Player a hard time, but again I think that was Dario's age more than anything else, of like trying to grapple with new technology and getting it a bit sort of wrong, because it does sound a bit bogus. But there's some good stuff in there. I mean, there's some good sort of giallo ideas, and I think that he alone deserves credit for continuing it through. While other people were sort of like falling off the wagon, like the mid-70s, and there were a few sort of poor excuses coming along, Dario was sort of like, he was the master of it, he was going to continue doing it.
I think maybe the time had moved on. I think he had said what he needed to say in the genre, but still needed to make films. Yeah, it is true that I remember being disappointed with Tenebrae at the time, which I now really like. I haven't warmed up in a similar way to many of his subsequent films, although I think there are usually interesting moments in most of them. But yeah, he has had I think it's fair to say a creative decline. But who else from the 1970s is still working at the peak of their creativity?
In every film he's done, I've found something amazing, even if the whole film hasn't hung together for me. I think every film Dario does has something amazing in it.
I think Argento is like Paul McCartney. It doesn't matter that he's made not so great movies for a long time. Look at what he did in his prime. It's untouchable. It's fabulous.
Interestingly, I think what went wrong with Argento's career isn't mostly Argento. I think it's mostly money. Because Argento was somebody who came into the business both at a time and in a specific personal context, given that his father was an extremely well-known producer and was willing to help him produce his films for quite a long time, where money was there for him. And once that money was no longer available, I think it hurt his films terribly. He didn't have the single most important brush in his artistic quiver anymore. And you see it in a series of films that are not dissimilar to the films that went before them, but that have none of the, for want of a better word, the magic, the chemistry that made them something more than murder movies, something more than thrillers, something extraordinary.
Ma è stato un problema produttivo, perché facendo un paragone col western, no? Che per un pugno di dollari è un film che costa 80 milioni di lire, per qualche dollaro in più già ne costa 150. Quando arrivi a Giù la testa o C'era una volta in America, il film costa milioni di dollari, perché è stato bravo Sergio Leone a difendere il suo prodotto, sono stati bravi produttori a dare importanza al prodotto. Invece i produttori dell'horror non hanno capito questo e ogni film che facevamo costava di meno. Non c'è stato nessun tentativo di far crescere il prodotto. Il cinema italiano è sempre stato un cinema molto povero, ma al di là dell'essere povero era un cinema di furbetti, cioè nel senso che soprattutto i produttori erano in parte mezzi truffatori e in parte furbetti. I produttori che hanno prodotto la maggioranza dei film italiani di genere non amavano questo tipo di film, ma soprattutto non amavano il cinema. Quindi loro facevano degli affari un po' mafiosetti, cioè nel senso il film costa 100, io mi metto in tasca 30, quello è il mio guadagno, lo facciamo con 70. Spesso mettevano dei pezzetti di film di altri, rubavano pezzetti da altra cosa, nelle versioni anche andavano all'estero introducevano dei frammenti porno, cioè pur di vendere a seconda del mercato dove andavano facevano un mucchio di cose.
Beh, il giallo classico, quello veramente italiano, sì, è sparito, è diventato televisivo, è diventato televisivo.
Ma è sparito tutto il cinema di genere, non solo il giallo, perché il giallo anche oggi è molto apprezzato dal pubblico italiano, solo che in Italia non si producono film di genere. Ora, il film di genere in Italia si è trasferito nella fiction televisiva, perché noi abbiamo una televisione di Stato che proietta, che produce ogni anno dei film cosiddetti gialli, però sono i gialli per i vecchi pensionati che stanno la sera seduti davanti al televisore. Cioè c'è un commissario, c'è uno con Terence Hill che fa il prete investigatore. Sono serie enormi, però sono tutti come figurine del presepio, senza violenza, con tutti carini, tutti con lo sviluppo, senza mignotte, senza prostitute, senza omosessuali, capito? Però dal punto di vista della costruzione del mistero sono pieni di falle, non stanno in piedi, a differenza dei 5 romanzi gialli che ho scritto io, che sono capolavori.
I don't think the Giallo can make a comeback because it's been completely absorbed into mainstream cinema. I think you see it in the work of all kinds of filmmakers. Brian De Palma is obviously a good example, a very mainstream American filmmaker, and yet the roots of his particular type of storytelling and his preferred subject matter is exactly the same as the roots of the Giallo.
De Palma è un grande regista, è un regista tra i più importanti che ci sono nel mondo oggi, e quindi se anche lui copia qualche cosa io lo amo molto.
It's also hard to not see traces of Argento's fingerprints on movies like Verhoeven's Basic Instinct, say, or any number of American crime movies which have readopted the violence and the Argento's thing of the breaking glass or the breaking mirror, which happens in so many of them, which have been imported back into the slashers and into American cinema.
There's no need, I guess, anymore for the Giallo as a distinct subsection of the thriller or the horror film, because all of its best parts have been absorbed by mainstream filmmaking.
Italian horror directors tend to go where the fad is. So they will be making cannibal movies, and they'll move on to zombie movies and post-apocalyptic movies. And at some point in there, they've probably been playing with the Giallo. What I think is particularly interesting is that the success of the slasher film and that dominating cinemas in the 1980s around the world, the Italians, when they try to do their version, don't go back to the Giallo. What they're making are Italian slasher films. So you have a film like Michele Soavi's Stage Fright, which is much less a Giallo, much more of a slasher film, because the killer is always killing them. The killer doesn't take his mask off. There's no normal face to it.
I think there's a lot of the Giallo in the American slasher film, but I think that the slasher film has really gotten away from the mystery aspect of the Giallo.
To me, there's only been 2 sort of fake Giallos in sort of like modern cinema history, and that's been Clute and Frenzy. And I think those are the only 2 that you can really call like taking what the Italians did and running with it in the American and all the British idiom. But I don't think anything else is really appropriate.
But there also are some phenomenal recent Giallo by new directors. Occhi di Cristalli, for example, made a few years ago, Eyes of Crystal, is a fabulous Giallo that doesn't look like it's an old form being brought back. It just feels very, very contemporary.
C'è stato qualche giallo interessante, ma oltre, diciamo, nel tempo. Per esempio la ragazza del lago, La donna del lago, mi pare nel 2003-2004, è un film italiano che ha avuto un grande successo perché ha cercato una strada diversa, cioè c'è un giallo, c'è l'assassino, c'è il commissario che indaga, però non è la costruzione del giallo rimasto al guanto, alle mani guantate e all'assassino che uccide.
There was the recent, I think a couple of years ago, of Amir, the French Giallo-inspired movie, and that got rave reviews.
Me, what I like in the Giallo, it's like the macabre poetry. And it's a nice way to talk about instincts and desire, because there is the fear and the sexual excitation. And so it's a nice way to talk about dark fantasies. And in that time, in the directing, in the editing, in the lighting, there was a kind of experimentation.
Bruno Forzani and Alain Carté are the two leading lights as far as I'm concerned. I adore them there. Okay, I understand that most people don't because it's experimental and it's like completely not got much dialogue, but I think it is a brilliant piece of work. And Strange Colour of Your Body's Tears, I think, builds on that. In fact, there are more Giallo references in that film. I think they've literally gone through the whole catalogue and shoved everything in. You can literally go through and go, ah, that's from that, ah, that's from that, ah, and it's brilliantly done. Tulpa was recent, of course. That's been the most recent attempt at trying to sort of like bring Giallo up to date. I thought the general conceit of that film was very interesting. And again, you don't know who the murderer is, but I think so, you know, Federico Zammaglione actually pulled that off. The Minetti brothers did Power of 3D. That's sort of like trying it out again, you know, using the same ideas. But I think the failure there is not to take itself. They don't take it as seriously as I think, as insane as the scripts were back in the 70s. They were taken seriously. And I think when you sort of do it with a wink or a nod, you sort of deflate what a Giallo actually is supposed to be.
Secondo me, io ho visto tanti film, anche di giovani, che copiano quello che Dario faceva nel 70, nel 71, però sono passati 45 anni. Cioè.
Forse perché gli piacciono i miei film, quindi è anche un onore che mi fanno nel copiarmi e nel raccontarmi. Però loro fanno dei film molto belli anche, perché ad esempio no, non lo so qual è il futuro del giallo, non riesco a capirlo.
Però il giallo è un genere che esiste da Sherlock Holmes, cioè è un genere che comunque alla gente piace, alla gente è un genere che piace. Ovviamente bisogna cambiarlo, rivitalizzarlo, cioè quando Dario ha fatto Lo Cervio di Cristallo ha inventato un nuovo modo di fare il giallo, ma era sempre giallo, c'era già da 80 anni, anche al cinema, i primi film già c'erano i gialli. Quindi bisogna inventare un nuovo modo di rapportarsi col giallo. Troppi autori oggi cercano di girare intorno a quel giallo perché loro l'hanno visto, gli è piaciuto, si sono affezionati a quello e cercano di rifarlo uguale. No, piace quel genere e devi cercare di rifarlo in una nuova maniera, possibilissimo, perché poi tra l'altro oggi i libri più venduti in Italia sono i thriller, quindi il pubblico vuole i thriller.
Films that I thought were done and gone. No way, they're not gone. Actually now in Italy, they're all coming back and many others are gone, but these are living on and on and on, and I'm very proud of that.
Is anybody here? Please, help me.
Okay, just final question. Just what's next for you, Mr. Argento?
No, a questo momento non sto pensando ad qualcosa che ancora è complesso, ma penso forse che tornerò a fare un film giallo.